There is something strange happening in The Boys right now that I do not think enough people are paying attention to. For years, the series trained us to believe that everything was building toward one inevitable final confrontation, one final war, one final monster standing at the center of the apocalypse. Homelander, the strongest soup alive, the face of Vought, the living embodiment of unchecked power. Every season pushed him closer and closer toward becoming something truly unstoppable. More violent, more unstable, more detached from humanity itself. And naturally, that made viewers assume the ending of The Boys would eventually revolve around stopping him once and for all. But honestly, the closer the story gets to its endgame, the more it feels like Homelander is not actually the final villain at all. And the terrifying part is, I think the show has been quietly telling us this from the very beginning. Because when you really step back and analyze The Boys carefully, Homelander starts looking less like the true source of evil, and more like the result of something much larger hiding underneath the surface of the entire world itself. A symptom, a product, maybe even a distraction. And once you start looking at the story from that angle, the entire series changes. Because suddenly, the scariest thing in The Boys is not Homelander anymore. It is the system that created him. One of the biggest clues is something the show subtly reminds us of over and over again without directly saying it. Homelander was never born naturally into power emotionally. He was manufactured, engineered inside a laboratory, raised by scientists instead of parents, treated like an experiment long before he became a symbol. That detail matters far more than people realize. Because villains usually represent choices. But Homelander almost feels like an outcome. The inevitable result of a machine designed to remove humanity from a person and replace it with power instead. Everything terrifying about him was built intentionally. Vought did not accidentally create Homelander. They created exactly what they wanted. A controllable god, powerful enough to dominate the world emotionally, politically, and commercially. And honestly, that may be the biggest hidden truth in the entire series. Homelander was never truly in control. Vought was. Even now, when Homelander appears more powerful than ever, the story constantly reminds us that his existence still revolves around systems much bigger than himself. Media, propaganda, public approval, political manipulation, corporate influence. The terrifying thing about Vought is that they do not simply create superheroes. They create narratives. They manufacture identity itself. That is why Vought feels more dangerous than any soup ever could. Because Homelander can destroy cities. But Vought can reshape society. And systems like that do not die easily. This is exactly why I think The Boys is quietly building towards something much darker than simply Homelander versus Butcher. The real final conflict may actually be about whether the world itself can escape the cycle that keeps producing people like Homelander forever. Because if Homelander dies tomorrow, does the machine stop? Honestly, probably not. Another hero appears. Another product gets marketed. Another generation grows up worshiping power again. The cycle continues. And that may be the true horror of The Boys universe. One of the clearest signs the show is moving in this direction is Sister Sage, because Sage changes the entire nature of the threat completely. Homelander dominates through fear and physical superiority. He is terrifying because he can overpower almost anyone alive. But Sage operates differently. She understands systems, psychology, human behavior. She manipulates structures instead of smashing through them physically. And honestly, that makes her potentially far more dangerous than Homelander ever was. Because Homelander is unstable. Sage is calculated. Homelander reacts emotionally. Sage plans long-term. And the series intentionally places her beside Homelander right as he begins psychologically falling apart more than ever before. That does not feel accidental. It feels symbolic. Almost like the show is quietly transitioning from one type of villain to another. From brute force into systemic control. And honestly, Homelander's emotional collapse may be the biggest clue that he was never meant to survive as the true Endgame villain. Every season pushes him closer towards psychological instability. He becomes more paranoid, more isolated, more desperate for validation. He lashes out emotionally instead of strategically. Even his victories feel increasingly hollow because deep down, Homelander is terrified constantly. Terrified of abandonment, terrified of irrelevance, terrified of losing love. That is not how final villains usually evolve. Final villains usually become more composed and more certain as stories progress. Homelander is doing the opposite. He is unraveling, and that makes him feel less like the final form of evil and more like a collapsing empire preparing the world for whatever comes next. But the biggest clue may actually be Ryan, because Ryan represents something far more dangerous than Homelander himself: legacy, the future, continuation. The Boys constantly frames Ryan as emotionally important in ways that go beyond a normal child character. He is not just Homelander's son. He is the next generation of power, still deciding what kind of person he will become. And that makes him terrifying because Ryan could become proof that the cycle never truly ends. Think about it. The entire world of The Boys is built around systems reproducing trauma over and over again. Vought create destruction. The public worships them anyway. Violence creates more violence. Power creates more corruption. And every generation inherits the damage left behind by the previous one. Ryan sits directly at the center of that cycle, which means the real final battle may not actually be about killing Homelander physically. It may be about preventing another Homelander from ever emerging again. And suddenly, the story becomes much bigger than one villain. It becomes a story about whether systems of power can ever truly be broken. Another detail people overlook is Compound V itself. At first, Compound V feels like a superpower serum. But the deeper the series goes, the more V starts feeling like a metaphor for corruption itself. Everybody who touches it changes. Governments become corrupted by it. Corporations profit from it. Families get destroyed because of it. Entire identities become consumed by it. Even characters who initially seem morally good slowly become darker the closer they get to power. That is not accidental. The Boys constantly suggest that power itself is addictive, not just but for society as a whole. People want gods. They want symbols. They want someone stronger than them to worship or fear. And Vought understands this better than anyone. That is why killing Homelander alone changes nothing long term, because the demand for power still exists afterward. The machine still exists afterward. And honestly, Billy Butcher's storyline may secretly prove this better than anyone else in the show, because Butcher's obsession with destroying Homelander slowly transforms him into something darker every season. Hatred consumes him completely. Violence becomes part of his identity. Revenge reshapes his morality until he increasingly resembles the same brutality he claims to hate. That may actually be the point. The Boys is not just exploring evil individuals. It is exploring cycles, systems, emotional inheritance, the way violence reproduces itself endlessly through trauma and obsession. And Butcher may ultimately realize too late that killing Homelander was never enough, because the real disease infecting the world existed long before Homelander himself. Which brings us back to the biggest terrifying possibility of all. What if the real final villain in The Boys is not a person? What if it is the world itself? The corporate machine, the political systems, the media manipulation, the public obsession with celebrity and power. The structure is capable of creating endless Homelander forever. Because systems survive individuals. And honestly, that idea feels far more disturbing than any laser-eyed soup ever could. That is why Homelander increasingly feels tragic instead of simply monstrous. Not sympathetic, not redeemable, but tragic in the sense that he was emotionally destroyed before he ever had the chance to become human properly. A child raised without love, without empathy, without identity, turned into a weapon before he even understood what humanity was supposed to feel like. Again, that does not excuse him, but it reinforces the deeper message of the series. Homelander was created, and stories about created monsters rarely end with the monster alone. Eventually, the story turns toward the people and systems responsible for creating them in the first place. And honestly, I think that is exactly where The Boys is heading now. Not toward a final battle against one man, but toward the horrifying realization that the world itself may always create another Homelander, unless the entire system finally collapses with him.